Afternoon Adventures. Welcome back to Spells Illustrated, the show where I talk about how spells can be good, try to illustrate situations where they are good, and point out situations where they are bad. This one is kind of bad. It's a spell called Enemies Abound. It's on the Bard, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard lists, and it is a weird one. So let's get started. I've set up our party, as you can see here, same as it's been for the last few episodes. And they are facing off against some devils here for no reason, really. I just kind of picked some minis. And someone on the party is going to cast Enemies Abound. It's not going to be William, our warlock, because he's a warlock. And this spell does not gain a bonus from upcasting. So don't really recommend it on warlocks, even if you're inclined to take it with other classes. But for a couple levels, I suppose it could be good before the cost of upcasting another spell, or casting a higher level spell, I should say, becomes greater than the need to cast this specific spell. So for the purposes of this example, let's say that our sorcerer, Croesus, is going to cast the spell, and he's going to go ahead and cast it on the biggest, fiercest looking enemy. That's going to be this guy in the middle. Now, mind you, this is a Pit Fiend mini, but we're going to assume it's something a little less ridiculous for the sake of example. It's just a big devil, who knows. But anyway, he gets Enemies Abounded, and let's assume he fails his saving throw, so now he sees his allies as enemies and has to factor that in when deciding what to do on his turn. His turn comes around, and maybe he decides to do a melee attack with that big old mace he's holding. He's going to choose, according to the spell, randomly from the creatures within range of the attack. Now, it's ambiguous if that includes movement or not. Personally, I think it should, because otherwise the spell barely functions, for melee units at least. So, anything within his movement range, which he has wings, let's say is probably like 40 or 60 feet. So it's going to be anything on the board. Now, I could roll a die to determine who he attacks completely randomly, but do consider that he sees everyone as an enemy at this point, and rolling a die would favor the party because there are 5 of them and only 2 of his allies. As a DM, I'm going to instead think about what he would do in a situation where it's him versus the world, when now he has 7 enemies, 2 of which he probably knows the power level of rather well, and 5 he may or may not. So he may see the ideal option as being to attack this person and keep everyone on one side of him to not allow himself to get surrounded. Most creatures would try to avoid being surrounded, even if there isn't a mechanical benefit to it, unless you're playing with flanking rules for some reason, but he's still going to probably want to not have enemies on all sides of him, which is exactly what the spell has just convinced him is happening. So maybe he comes over here and attacks this fellow devil over here, or maybe he casts a big fireball, and that's going to either target someone random. If you're playing it strictly by the way the spell's written, you might roll a die and have it centered on whoever it rolls. Though, let's be honest, as long as it doesn't roll this dude, it's going to pretty much hit everyone. Maybe if this guy gets targeted, 5, 10, 15, 20, no, that's still probably going to include everybody, depending how your rule circles. The point is, the spell is strangely written. Having everything be determined strictly randomly doesn't make a whole lot of sense for what the spell is supposed to be thematically. A creature being afraid and thinking that everything is out to get them is a good way to get a creature to run away, I would think. Let's look at another example. Since the spell is being cast by a sorcerer, Croesus, he is going to cast as a twinned spell, and he can target 2 creatures. Mind you, the spell does not benefit from upcasting, so this is the only way to target multiple creatures with the spell. And let's say in this example, he targets these 2 in the back because hopefully he can get them to fight each other first. That would be pretty nice. When I'm DMing, I always try to take into account what the players want to have happen. That's not necessarily what happens every time, but I at least consider it. So casting a spell that makes these creatures think that everyone is their enemy, and look at that, they happen to be right close to each other, that's probably what I'm going to have them do. And that's really the crux of things with this spell. If you play it strictly randomly, then it could have an effect. It could backfire wholly. If this creature rolls a die to determine who they're going to attack, and it rolls the number for the caster, that's bad. You've just harmed your own case here. Heck, it's possible both of them could do that. And now you've got a whole situation on your hands. Or it's perfectly reasonable to say this guy now sees all of these as enemies and thinks, that's too much, I'm getting out of here. And maybe this guy thinks, I'm the toughest guy alive, I can take all these guys on, I'm gonna cast a big ol' spell and just hurt all of these creatures. That's also very possible. But in that case, he would at least most likely damage that guy as well. So, is that worth the 3rd level spell slot? That's going to be kind of up to you and the actual situation. Obviously, I can't go over every conceivable situation. This is one where you really gotta play by ear. I do want to point out one more thing. Let me grab some different minis here. Okay, you may notice the battlefield has changed a bit. For another example, let's talk about choosing your targets. Croesus is going to cast Enemies Abound, and obviously he wants to target the most powerful thing on the battlefield, that T-Rex right there. So he casts his spell, and the T-Rex falls under his, well, not under his sway, but thinks that the things next to him are enemies. So he's going to start biting and tail whipping and all of that. But that leads to a different problem in this scenario. That's that the spell allows for an additional saving throw every time the creature takes damage. Now, if you know your monster manual, you may have noticed already there is a fire elemental and an ochre jelly on the battlefield. Both of these have features that cause you to take damage when you hit them with a melee attack or touch them for any reason. So, when this enemy's abounded T-Rex decides the things closest to him are the biggest threat and bites the fire elemental, he gets another saving throw against the spell. And when he tail whips the ochre jelly, because he can't target the same creature with both of those attacks, he takes acid damage and gets another save against the spell. So the smarter play in this situation would be to target the fire elemental or the ochre jelly, because then they can attack the T-Rex or possibly party members. Again, the spell is not a sort of dominate or any of that. But there's less of a chance that they will damage themselves making attacks and get to make those extra saves. And now I'd like to take a step back for a moment and sort of look at control spells in general, because a lot of really good control magic starts kicking off at level 3 and level 4 spells. So if you're trying to remove a threat from the battlefield, there are plenty of spells that can do that, and this spell isn't one of the better ones by a pretty long shot. The 3rd level spell, Hypnotic Pattern, can straight up end an enemy's influence on the encounter for up to a minute, assuming they don't take damage in the meantime, of course. The 4th level spell, Banishment, can fully remove a creature, or more than one if you twin it or if you cast it at higher than 4th level. And other spells like Wall of Stone, Wall of Force, things like that, can block off parts of the arena or dome in or bubble a creature so that they can't affect your party. Or multiple creatures. So as far as control spells go that remove creatures from combat, Enemies Abound is already not very high on the list. And speaking of damaging enemies through your enemies, there are definitely better ways to do that. The Dominate spells are very good for that. Higher level, but viable. A lot of the spell's usefulness is going to come down to how your DM rules it, if they go full random or if they run it like the creature would reasonably in a situation where everything's suddenly an enemy. Let's set up one more quick example where perhaps there is a large enemy force. Maybe they're waiting for the party, maybe they're just kind of doing their thing, and Croesus is rolling well on stealth. Maybe he's invisible, maybe he just has stuff to hide behind. And he pokes his little head out, waves his little dragonborn fingers. I don't know why I'm saying little, he's probably like 7 feet tall. And casts Enemies Abound on one of these enemies. Depending if these are actually devils, the fire elemental is probably not a good choice. The T-Rex can attack the things that can damage him, although so can the other ones. But since these are probably immune to fire, they're probably going to be the best choice. So he casts Enemies Abound on this one. Actually, he can twin it. Why not these two? Even if the T-Rex gets some extra saves. It'll be funny. And then scurries away and hides again. Now, maybe these enemies are paying enough attention to pursue. Maybe not. Either way, they now have 2 very hostile creatures coming at the rest of them and each other. So if you can get a situation where you can cast the spell and get out, you could cause some pretty good chaos, actually. Especially if those targets have debilitating spells of their own, or damaging AoE spells, things like that. But even if they're just sort of basic combatants, they can still do some damage on their way out, before their friends have to knock them out or somehow subdue them. Normally I wouldn't recommend a sorcerer walk ahead of the party and try to do the scouting, but it can work really well. And with that, I think I've covered about everything I want to in this video about this strange spell. In conclusion, I think it really benefits from being able to cast it and back away behind some cover at the very least, especially if your party members aren't up in the mix, being potentially targeted. Causing chaos with this spell is really, I think, the best use of it. It doesn't get any benefit from upcasting, so I wouldn't recommend it on a warlock really. And it is highly situational, even if you are able to cast it with just a 3rd level slot. Twinning the spell, I think, is really the play here, and doing so from a position where you can get away from the ensuing chaos is really gonna be the move. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you all so much for watching. If you found the video informative, leave a like. If you want to see more, subscribe so you don't miss them. And I will see you in the next episode. Happy adventuring!